Good evening, everyone. This is the June ArchSoc talk, hosted by the Western Cape branch. And as usual in our COVID times, this is another virtual presentation through YouTube Live. This evening, we pre-recorded the presentation to hopefully make this a smoother and less buggy experience. We've had a couple of hiccups in the last couple of months. And so our guest is Dr. Justin Pargeter. He's South African, but he's based in Connecticut in the US at the moment. And so we pre-recorded the actual talk yesterday, and we've got that lined up for you. But we're both here, we're both live, and we'll be on the end of this talk for the questions and answers at the end. So Justin's talking about his Cango Valley Archaeology and Paleoscape project, which is centered around Boomplaas Cave and the surrounding area in the Southern Cape. And it's quite an exciting project, and I think you all enjoy the talk very much this evening. Boomplaas, many of you are familiar with it. It's got a long history. It's one of the most well excavated and documented sites in South Africa. And this is a new, reinvigorated project that is looking at all the new technologies that have come out since the first excavations that were carried out there, and applying lots of new methods in a holistic way to Boomplaas. And as I say, it's also looking at open sites in the area as well. So I'm going to queue up the presentation, and hopefully it goes through nice and smoothly. So just bear with me 1 second, and as I say, Justin and I are going to disappear off to the background, and we're going to pull the presentation in for all of you. So here we go. Okay, and so, Justin, can you still hear me okay?
I can, Nick, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, so your presentation should be playing now. I've got the live stream open up in another box, so let's see, it's catching up to us. Sorry, Justin, can you still hear?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for having me. My name is Justin Pargeter, and I'm a Paleolithic archaeologist. I'm an honorary research affiliate at WITS and UJ, and director of the African Paleosciences Laboratory at New York University. It's a great pleasure to be here with you, and great thanks to the South African Archaeological Society for hosting me this evening. My talk today is going to focus on the past, present, and future work at Boomplaas Cave, part of which I've been directing for the last few years. And I think, as many of you will know, Boomplaas is one of Africa's most important paleoscientific research archives. But before diving too deep into Boomplaas, I wanted to take a step back and just to chat about something that I think all of us here can agree on. The fact that technology has come to dominate nearly every aspect of our lives. Who would have thought just 5 decades ago that I would be giving this talk to a room filled with no one, so that I could be recorded, edited, and channeled across an ocean to be beamed to an eager audience 8,000 miles away? It's mind-blowing. The examples of this abound in our world. Take, for example, this famous scene from Newlands Cricket Ground in Cape Town. I wish I was there today. Everything in it has been impacted by technology in one way or another. Even the humans, our jaws, our guts, our limbs, and most importantly, our expensive and energy-hungry brains have all been impacted by technology. One of the most remarkable things about this image, though, is just how many people there are. Cape Town has a population density of roughly 1,800 people per square kilometer. Now, without long interbirth intervals and high costs of child rearing, we should not be able to achieve this rate of reproductive success. So, how do we do it? Well, one answer is that technology has enabled us to produce food surpluses that subsidize the costs of large populations with very slow maturation rates, like humans. This process has resulted in a very powerful biocultural feedback loop that you see depicted here, where technology allows us to influence our environments, and our environments influence back onto that technology that we use, which allows us to extract surpluses and food to subsidize these large populations, enabling population growth and sharing, which enables us ultimately to feed these energy-hungry brains of ours, which eventually leads to more and better technology. However, figuring out precisely what ecological, biological, and technological processes are associated with our remarkable evolutionary success and this remarkable and interesting biocultural process remain largely unknown. But fortunately, because of Africa's rich and diverse archaeological record, the answers are not unknowable. My research seeks to fill gaps in our understanding of the human technological niche through the following key questions. The first is, I ask, what effect did technology have on our evolution? And second, what role or roles did environmental shifts play in these processes? Now, answering these complex and multifaceted questions places an incredibly high demand on the need for multidimensional archaeological data of a very high quality. Now, fortunately, we in Southern Africa are very lucky to have access to just the right kinds of archaeological sites to answer these questions. Boomplaas Cave is one of a handful of sites in Africa with the high-resolution late Pleistocene, that's roughly the last 125,000 years, archaeological records necessary to examine the long-term co-evolution of humans' biology, culture, and the rapidly changing and shifting climatic contexts. The cave is located in South Africa's greater Cape Floristic Kingdom, adjacent to a series of world-renowned archaeological sites that I'm pretty sure anyone in the audience today is familiar with, or perhaps some of you have had the pleasure of visiting, such as Boomplaas Cave, Pinnacle Point, Nelson Bay Cave, and Classes River Mouth. Boomplaas is about 75 kilometers from the current Indian Ocean coastline, a good few hours drive. During peak glacial periods when the planet's oceans fell and its coastlines expanded outwards, Boomplaas would have been upwards of 175 kilometers from the nearest coastline, in a completely terrestrial world, very different to the one that we find it in today. The Boomplaas, the site, is located at approximately 700 meters above sea level in a modern environment characterized by fynbos and renosterfeld elements in an otherwise complex mosaic with variation driven by steep differences in topography, climate, edaphic or soil, and ecological conditions. The image on the right-hand side here shows how Boomplaas is also located in a region characterized by strong aridity gradients, ranging from the coast inland, and mediated by the effects of the region's high topographic variability, its mountains essentially, that impact the distribution of rainfall in this area. Now you'll also note from this plot that the southern Swartberg flanks, in which Boomplaas is located, provide freshwater sources that break the region's aridity profile. I've actually got a little video here to show you what some of these look like. So here you see a freshwater source flowing right from the lower reaches of the Swartberg Mountains nearby Boomplaas. It's quite likely that natural resources such as these attracted prehistoric humans to the area in the past. This is an east side view of the Cango Valley in which Boomplaas is located. The image shows the site's position between the Klein and Groot and between the Rooiberg and Swartberg Mountains. This high degree of topographic variability means that the site's prehistoric inhabitants would have had access to a wide range of plant and animal foods at any one point in time. The Boomplaas itself is a large limestone cave of about 225 meters squared, situated on the southern slope of the Swartberg Mountains, about 80 meters above the valley floor. This 3D model shows the cave after our recent restoration efforts, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. That clearly shows a view of the cave's interior and Hilary Deacon's main excavation trench that we've rehabilitated and set up for future work. The site was first excavated by the late Hilary Deacon and his team of pioneering archaeologists between 1974 and 1979. Here you see some faces that I'm pretty sure you're all familiar with. Hilary's goal was to develop a world-class archaeological archive to track late Quaternary environment and cultural relationships in the Southern Cape. And I just want to point out with the lower right-hand image that the archaeological puns were pre-hysterical, even back in the 1970s. The site was also instrumental in the careers of many of our discipline's most esteemed figures, such as John Vogel, Judy Seeley, and Margaret Avery, who have gone on to define the parameters of our science and to set the stage for scientific archaeology in Southern Africa. The Boomplaas preserves a long occupational sequence extending back to about 80,000 years ago at its base. However, the lower portions of the sequence are not very well dated at the moment. Hilary Deacon's excavations initially uncovered a 100-meter squared Holocene excavation area. But he narrowed these down to about 20 meters squared, which you can see in the darker orange here, and then to 6 meters squared, which are depicted in the brown area here, which he and his team then excavated down to bedrock and allow us a nice deep view onto the bottom parts of the sequence. The cave's deposits are well stratified with very discrete depositional units that in some cases are separated by non-occupation horizons, which are a fantastic resource because they allow us to look at cultural events separated or not inundated by the movement of material between them. Now, while Hilary Deacon excavated Boomplaas to an exceptionally high standard for the time, limitations in the methods of the day precluded the use of microstratigraphic or micromorphological techniques. That's basically just excavating on a really tiny scale that even today are a challenge to incorporate into any research. But that aside, Deacon's excavations unearthed a wealth of archaeological and paleoenvironmental remains, from an extensive micromammalian assemblage which comprised millions of bones, to macromammals, ochre, thousands of lithics or stone tools, ostrich eggshell and eggshell beads, hafted implements which are extremely rare in the Stone Age, pollen, charcoal, and macrobotanical remains. And together, Deacon and his team marshaled this evidence for some of the earliest systematic multi-proxy paleoenvironmental and cultural reconstructions in Southern Africa, arguing for a complex co-evolutionary relationship between ancient hunter-gatherers and their ancient environments. And as a result of its rich sequences and Deacon's meticulous standards, Boomplaas came to feature prominently in attempts to understand the late Quaternary paleoenvironments and human behavioral changes throughout Southern Africa and Africa more broadly. One aspect that was consistently emphasized in this work was the role of the last glacial maximum, which is one of our planet's most climatically volatile periods, in driving human behavioral changes in the Southern Cape. Hilary Deacon argued that Boomplaas's rich archaeological record from between about 30 and 20,000 years ago showed cold, dry, and harsh glacial conditions, drove humans to adopt miniaturized lithic toolkits, that's really tiny stone tools that you see depicted in this image here, that are also characteristic of the Middle to Later Stone Age transition in the region. Deacon emphasized that the Cango Valley's generally low ecological productivity would have accentuated these challenges for humans, making the Boomplaas sequence an important datum point for documenting these stresses and humans' responses to them. Now, this view of harsh glacial conditions driving technological innovations of the later Stone Age became quite common amongst a wide range of researchers, both in southern Africa and further afield. Their arguments stressed that hunter-gatherers exploiting of generally sparse or quite seasonally variable resources would have increased the selective pressures on them to adopt smaller, lighter, and more reliable toolkits that came in the form of these miniaturized implements. Now, while this proposition is intuitively persuasive, it has come under increased scrutiny as new paleoenvironmental and archaeological data have emerged in subsequent decades. As the literature on the paleoenvironmental record from Boomplaas has grown considerably since the first attempts to synthesize them, so too has a divergence of opinions concerning their interpretation. For example, on the left-hand plot here, you see Tyler Faith's data on grazing ungulate numbers from Boomplaas, showing spikes leading into the last glacial maximum in members YOL, LPC, and LP, designated by the blue box. Following the well-studied relationship between ungulate community richness and annual precipitation, Faith argues that these data show that the LGM was in fact quite humid and ecologically productive around Boomplaas. The right-hand plot shows Judy Seeley and colleagues stable carbon isotope values from Boomplaas's bovine enamel, showing that cool and humid C3 vegetation dominated the region during the last glacial maximum. These samples also show that the LGM was comprised of considerable variability. It wasn't just one thing. Chase and colleagues' Hyrax midden carbon isotope data from CAPP export, that's basically dung and droppings left behind from these tiny little cute creatures, located about 80 kilometers west of Boomplaas, corroborates the picture of a cool, humid last glacial maximum, if something that was somewhat perhaps variable, as you can see by the wiggles in this line, in the wider region. But it was followed by the onset of a far more variable set of conditions after the last glacial maximum that led to a significant regional aridification trend through the last 15,000 years in this part of the Southern Cape. Now, there are many issues that possibly drive these differences in interpretation. The first is that the data that are used to generate them are derived at different scales. That's at local scales at archaeological sites, regional scales from sources such as the Cango Caves or CAPP export, the Hyrax middens, and hemispheric scales from ice cores and sea cores that tell us about global climate patterns. And it's been challenging to relate existing data sets from Boomplaas to these regional, larger scale paleoenvironmental archives due to the poorly constrained Boomplaas chronology that I mentioned earlier on. Second, most of these measures are indirect records of climate. And the divergence of interpretation stems in part from the fact that the existing proxies, pollen, charcoal, etc., provide only an indirect connection to this climate that we're ultimately interested in. And they highlight the need for novel proxies that provide a more direct link to the target climatic and environmental variables that we're actually interested in. And most of the charcoal and pollen and phytoliths tell us more about vegetation than they do necessarily about climate. And lastly, there are very few studies who actually use ecological relationships between different kinds of taxa and organisms to facilitate their interpretations. There is some foundational work by Margaret Avery, and more recently by Margaret and colleagues such as Tyler Faith, to build these kinds of ecological relationship frameworks to interpret paleoenvironmental change, in this case using micromammals, modern distributions, and the relationship to rainfall and temperature to interpret prehistoric species distributions at sites like Boomplaas that are moving the argument forward, but are still quite rare in the field. Now, Boomplaas's relative lack of absolute dates and updated stratigraphic details make it almost impossible to accurately interpret the site's paleoenvironmental records, and importantly, to understand their relationship to cultural trends at the site. Moreover, Hilary Deacon's pioneering thesis research, based partly on Boomplaas's vast lithic assemblage, unfortunately only covered the later parts of the sequence, Resolving these issues required higher resolution archaeological data, a better chronological and paleoenvironmental framework, and a more detailed understanding of technological patterns between and within Boomplaas's various layers, going beyond those in its most uppermost horizons. So in 2008, we initiated some of this work with a series of new radiocarbon dates and the development of a Bayesian chronological model for the Boomplaas sequence. Our results confirm that the site was occupied in a series of low-intensity events during the last glacial maximum and immediately thereafter. With our increased precision through this new dating exercise, we were able to narrow the formation of these last glacial maximum members, LP, GWA, or HCA, that are circled in the blue bubble here, to a brief, almost 1,400-year period between 21,900 and 20,500 years ago. These results had big implications for interpreting the cultural sequence. For example, the last glacial maximum members, LP and GWA, were formerly considered to be sequential to each other. They followed each other. But now with the redating, we could actually show that they were contemporaneous with each other. They formed essentially at the same time. And this surprised us because the two members show vastly different lithic technological, raw material, and tool use patterns that you can see in the two lithic slides here, the one in the white and the one in the black. They're vastly different. And yet they formed almost at the same time at the site, or they were deposited almost at the same time. So this left us wondering whether these patterns resulted from rapid technological turnovers by the same people, or perhaps episodic visits to the site by different groups of hunter-gatherers. To address the issue of why technological changes occurred when they did at Boomplaas, Tyler Faith and I compared lithic and faunal data from the site's post-last glacial maximum member, CL. CL is an incredible member, rich and well-preserved, about a meter or so of deposit, packed chock full with stone tools, faunal remains, macro and micro, charcoal, beads, ochre, everything you could want. Plant remains too. It also has dates that constrain its formation very neatly to between 17 and 12,000 years ago, that period after the last glacial maximum, where those climate curves start to go crazy and variation starts to increase. We found through our data very strong indications that stone tool technologies shifted towards the use of highly miniaturized implements, including these tiny arrowheads over here that fit very neatly in the tip of my finger. These shifts occurred at the same time as the site being more intensively occupied. And so this suggests a relationship here between population demography, site use strategies, and changes in technology. Our faunal data that Tyler brought to the study showed that these technological trends occurred at the same time that the diet of these ancient occupants really took a turn for the worse. We found increased abundances of small-bodied and lower-ranked prey, such as hares and tortoises, and high survival skeletal elements from larger mammals, such as rich, meaty limbs, indicating a greater emphasis on skeletal parts, providing the highest energetic returns. This pattern is consistent with humans moving further to get their food, and or possibly the increased time to find food, because larger game was ultimately becoming scarcer in the region. The earliest appearance of marine shell in the Boomplaas sequence is also in member CL, which corroborates possible increased contact with coastal contexts at this time, either through exchange or group movement. Ostrich eggshell fragments serving as possible water storage vessels, or maybe for the blanks of the production of eggshell beads, tortoiseshell bowls derived from the food remains, and bone tools also increased sharply in member CL, making a very big break from technological patterns prior to this. And collectively, these data demonstrate that drier periods following the last glacial maximum in the Cango Valley provided less productive vertebrate resources with lower energetic returns than more humid periods, such as occurred during the last glacial maximum. And importantly, archaeologists have begun documenting similar trends at other post-glacial archaeological sites across the Southern Cape, suggesting that the social and ecological drivers of these changes must have been large scale. In that paper with Tyler Faith, we hypothesized that the region's late glacial or post-last glacial maximum climatic unpredictability and the dramatic landscape changes driven by rising sea levels on the Southern Cape coast led to population increases and competition for resources across the Southern Cape. These factors fueled something of a negative arms race in which foragers were inclined to invest less time in technology in order to reallocate resources to other pursuits, including foraging in more marginal environments and investing in social endeavors signified by those beads. These patterns of larger landscape reorganization raise interesting questions about how rapidly humans adapted to differing coastal foraging strategies. The Boomplaas data suggests that humans may have avoided rapidly shifting coastlines altogether and instead pressed inland, where resources may have been more marginal, but at least they were predictable. But the question remains, how old are these patterns? And did similar processes occur earlier on the Southern Cape in its prehistoric record? To begin addressing this issue, I studied a pilot sample of Boomplaas's member BP stone tool assemblage, dated to between 40 and 30,000 years ago, which Hilary Deacon had originally designated as belonging to the Middle Stone Age. My results show clear evidence for systematic bladelet production, these tiny elongated pieces here, bipolar reduction shown on the bottom left-hand side of the stone tool template, and lithic miniaturization reminiscent of the Middle to Later Stone Age transition at other sites. So the question then became, do these patterns occurring almost 20,000 years ahead of the last glacial maximum falsify that hypothesis that the Middle to Later Stone Age transition was driven by risky last glacial maximum environments? And if the lithic technological patterns that I've detected in member BP are indeed reflective of the Middle to Later Stone Age transition at Boomplaas, then does member BP's dating of between 40 and 30,000 years ago bring the Middle to Later Stone Age record at the site more in line with the early transition dates we see at other sites like Border Cave, where the transition is dated to between about 44 and 42,000, and previously was considered quite anomalous. Now, despite the clear importance of resolving these issues for our understanding of African prehistory and human evolution at large, it has become increasingly clear that in order to resolve these high-resolution questions, we'll have to reopen excavations at Boomplaas Cave and to begin a more systematic reanalysis of the site's existing collections. And this is where the impetus to start the Cango Valley Archaeology and Paleoscape project originated from. I'll call it CAPP from now on, just for brevity. CAPP's goal is to build on Hilary Deacon's pioneering work at Boomplaas, to build a new integrated archive of human-environment interactions for the site and the broader region. Our project uses a behavioral ecology framework to provide predictions for the links between changing environments in which humans live, the resources on which they depend, the mobility that is essential for the hunter-gatherer way of life, and ultimately, for the way that they organize their stone tool technologies, which we have ample evidence for. The framework is based on the premise that environmental change influences critical resources and their availability, such as water and food. These in turn lead to changes in human behavior, including shifts in mobility and technology. Resources, that's animal foods, plant foods, are thus central to potentially linking environmental change to behavioral change in the archaeological record, and they are core to the CAPP project methodology. CAPP has four principal research foci. The first involves landscape studies to source new paleoenvironmental proxy sites, such as those hyrax middens that I showed you earlier, as well as ethnobotanical and plant foraging experiments to better understand Boomplaas's rich plant remains that I admittedly haven't had a chance to talk much about today, as well as the prehistoric foraging patterns that might have left them at the site. And lastly, ecological and agent-based modeling and simulations to experimentally test a range of research questions about the evolution of human behavior under differing climatic and cultural contexts. Second, we've begun a systematic program to restudy and resample the extensive Boomplaas collections. These include macrofauna, microfauna, charcoal, existing sediment samples, bead collections, etc., and also importantly the stone tools that are currently housed at these eco-museums in Cape Town, and to whom we are gracious and very thankful. Third, we plan on reopening the Boomplaas excavations to obtain new paleoenvironmental and archaeological samples, and to redate Deacon's excavation sections starting at the last glacial maximum. These new excavations are going to improve the resolution and chronological control and build on the limited paleoenvironmental data available from the site currently. Now, we would actually be in the field right now doing this if it were not for the COVID pandemic that we're all sort of in together. And fourth, we have a multifaceted community outreach program designed to stimulate new interest in African paleosciences and to expose a new generation of young, dynamic South Africans to cutting-edge approaches in archaeology. Now, one of CAPP's core priorities is to obtain multiple paleoenvironmental proxies from a range of sources at different scales, starting at the cave itself, where our on-site paleoenvironmental archives will draw upon several different sources from the same excavation horizons to track changes in paleoenvironments and ecological productivity, alongside, ideally, evidence for shifts in site occupation patterns and technological changes that, as I've mentioned already, people like Tyler Father and I have a fairly strong grasp on through our work thus far. These new geochemical analyses will provide more precise things like moisture availability indicators through time, and will also provide direct insights into how ecological change influences humans' prey. Pollen, charcoal, and phytolith identifications will link these hydrological data to the vegetation patterns that we're ultimately quite interested in, and ultimately provide us a closer link to climate. We will then build onto these regional scale data through new rock hyrax midden sampling efforts. As you can see here in the map below, the proxy tables, those red bands essentially show you areas of high probability for finding new hyrax midden sites. And as you'll see with that star, they're right above Boomplaas Cave. So we're in really good shape here. We also have a collaboration to resample and redate the Cango Caves stalagmite, which is located nearby Boomplaas, just a few kilometers down the road, led by our collaborators, Stefan Woodburn at Timber Labs. These regional data will allow us for a fuller contextualization of the site's lithic, fauna, and paleoenvironmental materials. And ultimately, this multi-scalar approach is going to enable us to understand how conditions at the site changed and humans' use of the site in relationship changed to the surrounding regional landscape. Now, this unparalleled array of paleoenvironmental proxies will enable the most detailed reconstructions of local to regional environments from the late Pleistocene. It will allow us to effectively link variations, changes in these domains to changes in the global climate system. This initial stage of work is led by myself and my co-directors Brian Chase, Tyler Faith, and Jan de Vink. And yes, that is a giant piece of hyrax excrement that Brian is so gleefully holding above his head. Our efforts over the last 3 years at the site have mostly been spent mitigating what has been over 40 years of decay and damage to the site, which you can see on the right-hand figure here taken in 2018. When we initially began this rehabilitation work to restore the site to its pristine condition Hilary and his team left it in 1979, we presumed that humans were the largest perpetrators. But it soon became apparent that the local baboons were causing most of the damage to the excavation area and to the infrastructure at the site through their frequent site visits and their hunting and scratching for scorpions. We would move one sandbag in, they would move 2 sandbags out. They also love a good Marmite sandwich, I'll tell you that. This mitigation work would not have been possible without our gracious host, Mariette Krokamp, and the farm owner, and the tireless and skillful efforts of our local collaborator, Herman Nokia, and his incredible team comprising Isak, Dalmain, Gordy, and Indran, to name just a few of the amazing individuals who've made this work possible. They've helped us rehabilitate all the pathways to the site that you can see in this image, to install safe passageways across the local streams that crisscross the lower flanks of the Swartberg Mountain, to set permanent mapping datum points, as you see on the bottom right-hand side here, outside of the cave, that have become instrumental in our efforts to tie the Boomplaas excavation into a high-resolution geospatial framework, and to move and replace over 6,000 sandbags into the site, and importantly, to install a new and safer set of excavation infrastructure around the main excavation trench that you see in the top right-hand image here. And it's important just to emphasize that Boomplaas is on an active fault that's still alive, it's still active. So, no one wants to be 6 meters underground when that thing starts shaking if the infrastructure is not set up properly. So that's been a key priority for us. This is just an expanded view of the 3D model I showed you earlier, just showing you what 6,000 sandbags look like, firstly, over the surface of the site, completely protected those upper Holocene horizons. You can see the main excavation trench with that new scaffolding and infrastructure in place. And also just to point out, as we move around the corner here, these little targets attached to the wall here, they're essentially orientation points for us to allow us to set up our excavation equipment, our total stations, that essentially provide us with X, Y, and Z coordinates for everything excavated from the deposits and any pictures we take or samples we take from the excavation horizon. Now, all of these coordinates inside of the cave, and this entire 3D model, in fact, is tied back to the South African national grid system, which allows us to georeference and geolocate anything that we dig and map within the sites back out to the landscape and to other sites in South Africa. It will also allow us to expand our research into other parts of the landscape and to tie all of this data together. So we're in a really good place at the moment to be going back and starting this work. We just all need to get healthy and well. Our survey work in the larger landscape to understand the context of Boomplaas a bit better has unearthed incredible landscape evidence too, such as possible evidence for coastal contact in the form of possible marine shell remains from open-air contexts, extensive ochre deposits, and potentially very old in-situ archaeology, such as this hand axe made on quartzite from just a few kilometers away from Boomplaas. We've also discovered several new and unexcavated rock shelter deposits with visible archaeology on their surface that will in the future become key resources for better contextualizing the Boomplaas sequence. Ideally, we're finding excavatable materials here that we can absolutely date and then get an idea of what people are doing outside of the cave itself and how behavior is varying in response to the kinds of ecological differences that we know exist across the Cango Valley, rather than relying on one excavation point alone. It's also important to mention that many of these new sites that we've discovered actually do have high racemium or Hyrax midden deposits in them too. So there's the potential here to be excavating paleoclimatic records right next to archaeological deposits, which is incredible. In terms of our revisiting the museum collections at Iziko, Alison House, currently a postdoc with Marion Bamford at Wits University's ongoing re-examination of the Boomplaas charcoal assemblage is showing promising results with the discovery of several new last glacial maximum tree taxa, suggesting that environments at this time comprised woody tree species and that the environment was possibly quite a lot more complex than we had previously assumed. And her ongoing work is going to tie these data back into this multi-proxy paleoenvironmental framework that we're setting up. The CAPP project is also going to continue our ongoing community outreach and education efforts with science communication specialists, Jive Media Africa. Jive have helped us to produce and disseminate bilingual, that's English and easy classa, comic materials, comic book worksheets that you see here that communicate information about archaeology to South African primary and high school students through the science buzz and network across South Africa that reaches over 10,000 school kids with each distribution. This project places very strong emphasis on integrating expertise from career researchers like ourselves with local heritage authorities and media skills to promote what has thus far been a primarily Black female-driven narrative centered on historically marginalized groups in a larger context of trying to change the face of South African archaeology for a new generation. And the feedback we've received thus far from kids is that they absolutely love them. CAPP has also partnered with the nearby Cango Caves to update their existing archaeology exhibit, which I'll just show you in a quick spin around here. And it's an incredible exhibit. A lot of information, very accurate. I've visited museums all over the world that don't come close. But of course, we have new data in the decades since it was last designed. And we're very excited to be building on our knowledge and information and disseminating it through the space at the Cango Caves. And they've been incredibly welcoming to our team to do that. We also are in the process of designing new interactive content for the exhibit through our 3D modeling exercises that you've seen a little bit of. Content that's going to interact with people's phones and allow you to explore a little bit more about the archaeology of the region without necessarily having to visit these very fragile sites that are nearby. And the reason why we have to sort of manage that access a little bit is just because the Cango Caves receives over 250,000 visitors a year. Now, that's an incredible chance for us to make real and meaningful impacts with these activities, unlike many other sites in South Africa that are set quite far away from these kinds of massive tourist attractions. But at the same time, we need to preserve and protect the heritage that we're trying to promote. So we're engaged in this work and super excited to keep on taking it forward and growing it. Now, the CAPP project in general synthesizes researchers from over 17 universities and research organizations from across the globe, but with a very strong emphasis on South African paleosciences, because, hey, local is lekker. And ultimately, this incredible team of paleoscientists has come together to answer these complex questions about the evolution of human behavioral variability in what are clearly shaping up to be some very dynamic environments. And so we've got a really nice team set up here to track and tack away at these complex questions over the next few years. We've also strived to provide a robust and multidisciplinary collaborative research and training network for students, both in the United States and in South Africa, through our collaborations with research laboratories at Nelson Mandela University, through the isotopic work that we are doing and are planning to do at the University of Cape Town with individuals like Vincent Hare, and through Itemba Laboratories up in Johannesburg. We hope to continue to promote the development of African paleosciences through these partnerships. And in closing, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to listen to this talk. And I'm really hoping that this brings to life a new passion and a renewed interest in what is one of South Africa's most treasured paleosciences archives. Looking forward to your questions. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for having me. My name is Justin Pargeter, and I'm a Paleolithic archaeologist. I'm an honorary research affiliate at WITS and UJ, and director of the African Paleosciences Laboratory at New York University.
Thanks, Justin. I think the video is just replaying on a bit of a loop, so I'm just giving it a second to finish itself. Maybe a few seconds there. Okay, good. I think it's done. Thank you. That was an amazing talk. I think that really worked very well this evening, and it was much clearer than most of our talks. So, yeah, we've got one question so far from Guillaume, and I think you saw it while you were watching the talk as well. It's all about looking at the raw material that was used, whether there's a change in the material used that follows a similar pattern than the technological shift. Hope that makes sense.
Yep. And I'm assuming that Guillaume is referring to the late glacial assemblage that Tyler Faith and I were looking at. And there, yeah, the raw material shift is dramatic. Actually, we find sort of reversion to hyperlocal sources, which is mostly quartz, that occurs in veins and seams around the site. So literally, you could spill out from the cave and collect the stuff, and almost the entire assemblage gets made on it at this time. And interestingly, although the mineral, quartz, is available right by the site, they're still using it to the nth degree to make these miniature implements, and the cores are tiny. So there's an effort to conserve the material even though it's local, which runs counter to a lot of archaeological thinking that when something is available at the site, it should be conserved less than something from further away. So the Boomplaas sequence kind of upends a lot of this traditional thinking about why technology changes the way it does. And I think the reason that they're using local rocks more intensively is just a reflection of the broader pressure on the landscape as a whole in terms of resource distribution, so that even something that's right on your doorstep becomes quite precious if something 20 kilometers down the valley is no longer accessible anymore, which in the case of Boomplaas is rocks like silkreed, for example, which is not found in the valley. So
Mm.
it's a fascinating period, and a lot of this really dynamic behavior occurring with parallel shifts in raw material, uh, possibly symbolic material culture production, the climates. It's a really amazing time period to be looking at.
Mm. Makes me think a lot about a site that we were excavating with Alex Mackay in the Pitslachter. And we were just getting these tiny quartz, flakes that you just, how on earth were they working with this stuff?
Is
So
that
small.
that's pits like the oats?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, I know
Such a
that.
strange part,
I
yeah.
know that assemblage quite well. Yeah, it's yeah, and Alex has done a fantastic job of tying all that material to the During River and looking at what drives mobility in terms of access to water. Um, and I think he's done a great job of sort of moving away from traditional narratives of what changes technologies to more behavioral and ecological driven arguments, which are complex, but as you can see from my talk, are also ones that get us to the root of human behavior and why it changes.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of synergy, and it's quite fortuitous that those projects are happening at the same time. So you've got two, well, not just two regions. I mean, Eric Fisher was on the other day, and so there's multiple areas where the very complex, multidisciplinary, holistic studies going on. So it's really come together. So it's very nice to watch and follow this. So hopefully we've got another question. Let's see if anyone is. So Tim Hoffman has popped a question on. Are there any wetland sites in the vicinity where sediment cores can be retrieved and analyzed to determine the nature of surrounding paleoenvironments from fossil pollen and other proxies?
Yeah, it's a good question, and ultimately we would love to have as many of these different terrestrial proxies as possible. The region is not very conducive to the formation of traditional wetlands, at least around the Cango Valley, in the areas that I've surveyed and looked at, and Deacon did too. But if you move a little bit up into the Groot Karoo, there are some ephemeral wetland deposits that have been sampled. None of them are very extensive in terms of the chronology, and the sampling is sporadic. So, for this region, you're really the gold mines for paleoenvironmental archives are really the rock hyrax middens and the speleotherms from these limestone caves. So we're going after those first because, as you saw from those probability maps that I showed with the red bands above Boomplaas, those are areas where we have we're almost certain to find new hyrax midden deposits. And given the dates of these deposits elsewhere at Stever-Vierksport and in the further Western Cape, they're likely to cover this period of the late Pleistocene. And they are incredibly high resolution. They can be directly dated with radiocarbon. They record micro pollen, micro charcoal. We're working with Irene Esteban to look at the phytoliths in them. And then of course you get your stable isotope data from them that track precipitation and humidity and vegetation changes. So with those in check, it's almost like we don't really need wetland deposits really, unless we believe that they might tell us a story unique to their formation that might differ from how a Hyrax midden, the story a Hyrax midden would tell. And there is some reason to believe that, maybe perhaps with regards to nitrogen, hyraxes take up water in very specific ways, and the nitrogen might be impacted by that. So if it's that proxy, then we might look for other sources to determine what the nitrogen is telling us. But for the rest of them, pollen, charcoal, phytoliths, all the rest of the stuff, it's the hyrax middens are the gold standard. And keeping in mind that the goal is to derive exactly the same samples from the excavation itself. And so we can then do what not many other studies are able to, which is control for the anthropogenic effect on these proxies by looking at the archaeological deposits and then their non-occupation horizon. So, when people weren't at Boomplaas, what was the climate like? Because often we've got this survivorship bias when we do these paleoenvironmental studies where we know what the climate was when people were there, and we base our conclusions based on that. But what was it like when they weren't there? Which is almost as equally an important part of the story. And so the on-site records give us that. We match them up with the Hyrax middens and the speleotherms from Cango Caves and elsewhere. And we've got a pretty big story already just based on that. But we are surveying and we are working in the landscape, and we may find other types of wetland deposits, or perhaps even the kinds of soil accumulations that might allow us to get other kinds of terrestrial cores into the landscape. That's something that we would ultimately do if we came across the right sites.
Yeah, fantastic. Looks like we have a quiet audience this evening. It was about 40 people in the end. Yeah, I'm just trying to see if anyone has a last question or two. I've enjoyed, it's worth saying, I've really enjoyed working with you on the Science Spaza that you mentioned towards the end of the talk as well. So, and this is the second, I think, edition coming out after the one that Eric Fisher mentioned in his talk. So it's a lovely initiative, and I think that it's more than 10,000 school children. It'll be fantastic that they're going to receive this content, and it's been done in such a nice way, and it's very accessible, and I think it's going to do a lot of good. And we've made links to these, the published ones anyway, on the website, on the ArchSoc website. So if anyone wants to check them out, they can do so. We've got another question. So Bakara Sprate is asking, will you be using Zoom Zoom S, or I'm not sure what was, Zoo MS. Okay,
Yeah.
so so we thought it's about Zoom. Okay, so Zoo MS. So there we go. That's what the
Yeah.
species are.
Yeah, it's a funny acronym. I know what it's Kara, what she is talking about. Yeah, it's a Bakara. Sorry, I'm not sure if it's
Yes, Bakara. Yeah.
male or female. Sorry. Um, yeah, and just to finish on the Science Baza theme. Yeah, I think of all the stuff I've done in my career, I'm most proud of and I think that we're really keen to keep that alive. And if anyone is out there with deep pockets and wants to support science outreach in Africa, made by Africans for Africans, please let me know, because we're always looking for money to make more of them. And we've got lots of cool themes, and we've put this incredible production team together with Jive Media, Science Plaza, Nick Wilshire with Open Heritage. And that we're all African. Like, it's just this incredible team, and none of it relies on outsourcing. We're doing it in Africa, which is just amazing. And the stories we're telling are driven by African figures. Joshua Kumbani, for example, in the latest one, what cool work being done by our own people. And so we just want to make more of them, and the challenge is always just getting traditional funding agencies to fund it, because they always want to see, the old stuff, dates, digs, papers, and they don't think about what the next generation is going to look like if we don't invest in this. And we need to work on this as a team and as a population. And I think we've got the infrastructure in place, and we'd love to make more of them. So yeah, I love the Science Plaza stuff, and there's a lot more to come. Then yeah, for Zoom, so that's zoo archaeology by mass spectrometry. This is kind of this like revolution that's happened in the analysis of animal bones from archaeological sites, where people now can put a identification on a bone based on its collagen peptide fingerprint, which is basically just saying that each bone has a signature to it, like your finger does, and that signature can be extracted from ancient bone using collagen, and you can then determine what animal it was. And that's really cool, because most of South Africa's prehistoric sites are comprised of just millions of smashed up bones. And it's been a huge challenge to identify them. We can weigh them, we can count them, we can date them, but we don't know what they are most of the time, unless you find the nice little bits at the end, the epiphyses and the identifiable elements. But the middle parts and the parts that are smashed up are just unidentifiable. So this technique has allowed zoo archaeologists to come in and like determine exactly what those things are, to some degree of clarity. Sometimes you can't get all the way down to a species, but there have been new libraries just published to do this, I think a few weeks ago, through the Max Planck, that help identifying African bovids, and sheep and goats, I think. So yeah, we're totally using it. It would be kind of crazy not to try it at least. The biggest challenge is finding collagen. Do the bones actually still have it? And there are a number of different things that could affect collagen preservation that are kind of reasonably well understood, but there's still a lot to figure out. And so we're going to start with something recent at the site. Some of you may know that Boomplaas has an incredible 0.5 meter of early evidence for domesticated sheep and goats entering into South Africa in the last 2,000 years. That hasn't been looked at for a long time. And the last time that those remains were analyzed was with traditional faunal identifications. So we're going to zoom through all of that and figure out how many sheep, how many goat, or if there are any sheep or goats, where this has been used elsewhere in South Africa. There have been some surprises, and actually many of the supposed sheep-goat remains have turned out to be wild animals. So we don't know, that might be the case at Boomplaas too, but we're going to start there because the collagen is likely to be preserved best up there, and then we're just going to push our way down and see how far we can get collagen preserved. If we can get it all the way to the the sort of MSA, LSA deposits, wow, that would just be incredible, and we'd be able to tell a lot about what people are eating, and most importantly, what they're smashing up more often, because that tells us about the behavior ecology of food consumption. If you're smashing something up to an nth degree, a certain species, it means that you're probably investing more in their procurement, which tells us a lot about the time and energy investments, which are central to the project's research questions. So we're absolutely going to be using Zooms. So kind of watch out for that.
Super. Yeah. Well, I think that's a wrap, guys. I think all the questions have come through. I've been checking out the chat box. Sometimes people ask a question right at the end, and literally as we're wrapping up, one pops in, and then we've ended the stream. So I think we just have Vivian who said, "Brilliant, thank you," and I think that's a nice way to end. And I'm going to say thank you as well. It was one of the best talks we've had. I thought it was fabulous. You had a mixture of wonderful material in your presentation, and it's such an ambitious study and so wide ranging that it really takes a lot of talent and skill to run a project like this. And I think we're very lucky to have people like you in our community. And I hope everyone enjoyed the talk this evening. And if when you're back in South Africa, we'll definitely be giving you lots of wine to say thank you.
Thanks. And thank you to the ArchSoc. It's always lovely to be with you, and unfortunately not in person. Would be lovely to see you all. Missing South Africa, missing the fields, but we'll be there soon enough. And you're always all welcome to come have ostrich steaks with us in Oudtshoorn. And otherwise, just stay safe, stay well, and missing you all.
Super. Thank you, Justin. I'm going to end the stream.